As first light spills over Karinya, life stirs inside a refuge built from second chances. Maeve O'Connor, ranger turned foster mom, has saved countless Joeys, but a trembling scrap of fur named Finn may be her greatest test yet. This is a tiny heartbeat racing toward the wild, and the woman who refuses to let it fade. The morning began as a thin blue bruise across the northern New South Wales sky, the kind that promises heat, even as frost clings stubbornly to wire fences and the corrugated roofs of machinery sheds. Beyond the jacaranda silhouettes, paddocks ran to a wavering horizon, patched with spinifex and scribbles of saltbush, the earth baked to the color of old blood. A wind from the inland rattled the gum leaves with a dry whisper. No rain in it, only the smell of dust and eucalyptus and long miles of road. Magpies tuned their flutes from power lines, and a lone road train moaned somewhere to the west, its cargo a tired hymn to distance. This was country that chiseled you down to the grain. Wiradjuri and Gamilare stories in the ground. Sun that knew every bone you'd ever broken. Nights so wide you could pour all your worries into them and still have room for stars. On that brittle dawn, Karinya woke. The name, soft as a lullaby, meant a place to rest. And yet, there was nothing idle in the way the homestead breathed itself to life. Kettle rattling on gas. Kettle steam fogging a window already scarred by years of summer. Boots set neatly on a mat made from old truck tires. A row of canvas joey pouches pegged beside the hearth like strange stockings, waiting for small, ancient gods. Maeve O'Connor stood in the doorway, steaming mug braced between hands as practical as pliers. She was a woman of late 50s, turned to early 60s by sun and weather, and the long timetable of rescue. Average in height, but strong in the shoulders. She carried herself with the tidy balance of someone who had spent years stepping over fallen limbs and reading the ground for tracks. Her hair, once auburn, had surrendered to a wild silver that she tied at the nape of her neck with a leather thong. The silver made her green eyes look young, though the fan of lines at their edges told a different, kindly history. Her skin was freckled and deeply tanned, the sort of tan you can't buy, only earn, etched by crow's feet, and the pale crescent scar on her forearm from a fence wire mishap in show 2. Beneath her rough-spun overshirt, she wore a faded t-shirt from a charity footy match. Wests versus Tigers. The ink cracked into tributaries. When she moved, there was a quiet economy to it. When she spoke, it was in a voice sanded smooth by years of gentle authority. She had been a ranger once, before the budget cuts and the funerals and the slow erosion of patience with paperwork. Still, the habits clung. Lists pinned with bulldog clips. Medications arranged in tidy ranks. A map of the district marked with yellow dots where lives had started again. Near her boot heel, Rusty thumped a tail. Rusty was an old red Kelpie cross, somewhere around 12, weathered to a brindled copper that matched his name. He carried a notch missing from his left ear, where a barbed wire had had its say years ago, and his muzzle had grown the dignified steel of age. His eyes, amber, watchful, rimmed with salt, held both the mild sorrow and steady humor of a dog who had supervised more than enough human folly to last him another lifetime. The pads of his paws were tough as river stones, but his trot had softened into a stiff-limbed shuffle in the mornings, easing to a jaunty amble once the sun worked oil back into his joints. He adored Maeve the way old dogs do, without flourish, just a constant orbit, pressed close when thunder came, stationed by the bathroom door if she coughed in the night. The phone rang, with that particular urgency a country landline takes on before sunrise. Maeve set the mug down, wiped her palm on her jeans, and answered. On the other end, a volunteer from the Highway Patrol's wildlife roster, Gary Blake, a compact bloke with a blunt kindness and a clipped mustache like a pencil mark, spoke in a low, urgent rush. Gary's voice carried the fatigue of a man who drove long blacktop in the dark and had seen too much of what headlights do to soft bodies. There'd been a collision on the Newell, he said. A gray female, dead at the verge. He'd checked the pouch. There was a Joey alive. Very small, very cold. He had bundled the little one in a beanie and his flannel shirt, cradled it under the dashboard heater, and now he was parked at the old shearing shed turnoff, waiting. No more than 3 months, Gary added. And in that phrase, Maeve heard the entire set of dangers. Hypothermia, aspiration, the quiet slide of a fading heartbeat. "All right," she said, and the word meant the whole machine of Karinya stirring up. Thermometer, milk replacer formula, sterile teats, warmed saline, a pouch big enough to be a cave, a hot water bottle wrapped in an old Bond singlet. "Give me 20. She whistled softly. Rusty rose like an accordion opening and followed her to the ute. The ute was an old Hilux, the color of faded denim, bonnet mottled with the constellations of stone chips, cab perfumed by eucalyptus drops, lanolin, and a ghost of petrol. There was a photograph taped crooked above the radio. Maeve, and a tall man with kind squinting eyes, and a jaw chiseled hard by labor, his beard salt and iron, and his hand swallowed around hers. Liam O'Connor had been a stockman, and a patient one, who had believed in mending things slowly. Fences, hearts, lungs. He'd built Karinya's first shade runs from scavenged corrugate, swearing softly when the wind came up. Then, 3 dry summers ago, he had gone quiet between one paddock and the next. The absence was still a room Maeve walked into daily, surprised to find no light on. Rusty stared at the photograph for a beat, a habit of his, and then settled with his chin on Maeve's thigh as she turned the key and the engine shuddered awake. The road wore its dawn mist, like a scarf left too long on a clothesline, ragged at the edges, drifting low over culverts where frogs still sang. They passed fence lines like stitched scars and windmills, shouldering slow circles against the pale sky. A wedge-tailed eagle lifted off the highway shoulder with a disgruntled heave, as if annoyed by the interruption of its breakfast. Maeve held the wheel light in her hands, eyes moving. Wombat burrow, fresh scrape in the gravel, the black shimmer of bitumen where a spill had dried last summer. She was thinking, 3 months means eyes still tight, skin like the thin heel of bread, jaw not yet learning the world of work. She set her jaw, as if that could lend strength across miles. At the old shearing shed turnoff, Gary's patrol car waited, red and blue lights dormant, but ready. He stood beside the bonnet in his high-vis jacket, compact and square, his dark hair pressed into a respectful submission by the cap. His mustache, the tidy pencil line, lent him a touch of old-fashioned charm that softened the tired brackets at his mouth. He cradled the bundle like an offering. "Warm as I can get him," he said by way of greeting, voice dropping almost to a whisper, as people do in the presence of something both fragile and fierce. Maeve looked into the circle of flannel and beanie. The Joey was small beyond reason, a half-made prayer of limbs and tail, skin drawn delicate and dry as parchment at the elbows, the fine dusting of new fur lying damp flat along his spine. The ears were folded like the corners of a letter. The mouth was closed, the lips pale. Yet when she cupped a finger gently against the tiny sternum, a tremor ran through the body, a pulse neither willing nor ready to quit. She felt the stubborn spark that had carried this little one through a mother's death and the cold hour after. "Hello," she said, and her voice shifted to the low sing-song used for nestlings and miracles. Rusty pressed closer, applying his own brand of ancient dog medicine. Warmth, breath, the slow, regulated beat of a heart that had shepherded dozens of lives from brink to balance. "Your mum?" Gary jerked his chin to the verge, and Maeve looked, because she always did, even when it cost her. The doe lay in the grass, with that humiliating stillness the living cannot mimic. A wash of sorrow moved through Maeve, brief, clean, acknowledged, like rinsing a wound with saline. "All right," she said again to Gary. "You did good." He shrugged, eyes flinching away from praise. "Figured you were closest. Figured you'd give him a chance. That's the only thing worth giving. She tucked the Joey beneath her jacket, against the heat of her own body, slid him into a soft pouch she'd brought, a faded cotton pillowcase with the hem sewn shut, and the neck cut and hemmed, smelling faintly of sunlight and eucalyptus. She added a warmed gel pack, wrapped in flannel, careful to set the temperature by the feel she carried in her hands as surely as any instrument. 33.5 degrees, the remembered country of a mother's pouch. In the cab, the heater on low, the old Hilux nosed back, into the waking land. The Joey, no, not the Joey anymore, not to her, made a small, stubborn movement, a ripple down the length of his tail, and pressed his face blindly against the cotton. "Finn," Maeve said, surprising herself with the speed of naming. The syllable flashed in her mind like sunlight off water. "Finn, because you're the little light we follow." Rusty lifted his head, as if agreeing to the terms. Karinya received them with the creaks and sighs of an aging house that had learned the rituals of triage. Maeve moved quickly now, the way experience teaches. Washed hands, thermometer ready, digital scale zeroed with a small cloth nest laid on its shallow plate. She turned on the heater in the lounge, laid an old woolen jumper over the back of a chair by the hearth, pegged a fresh pouch beside the fire, where the air rose warm and reliable. She checked the temperature of the gel pack, swapped it for a hot water bottle wrapped in Liam's old flannelette shirt. The blue one, soft from 100 washes, as if the weave of it remembered comfort and could be persuaded to share. She clicked the kettle, measured milk replacer powder into a small jug, with the fussy competence of a barista under pressure, then tempered it with boiled water and a water bath to bring it to the sweet spot. No hotter than a mother's breath, no cooler than a summery afternoon in the shade. Rusty patrolled the edge of the activity with ceremonial gravity, occasionally glancing at the open door, as if guarding the threshold between peril and safe harbor. Finn weighed in at little more than a handful of grams past a quarter kilo, the number beaming on the scale like a dare. His ears fluttered as Maeve tucked him deeper into the pouch, gravity and cloth conspiring to mimic the geometry of belonging. With the kind of patience that looks like magic to the uninitiated, she touched the tip of the sterile teat to Finn's closed mouth, traced the seam of his lips, waited for the reflex to bloom. The instinct lived inside him, older than roads or fences. After a beat, he gaped, pawed weakly, then sealed on. She tilted the bottle so milk filled the nipple but did not flood it. Never a gush. Always a slow, steady promise. He swallowed. The sound, thin, decisive, broke something open in the room. Maeve exhaled a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. "Good lad," she murmured. "Little light." She counted the sucks, paused to let him breathe, tilted him upright with 2 fingers behind the jaw and 1 along the spine, cradling the wobbling column of his newness. Between sips, she rubbed his chest with the lightest circles to keep the rhythm of swallowing even, to coax the tiny machinery into confidence. Rusty's nose twitched. His tail rat-tat-tatted the floor 2 times, as if punctuating the moment with hope. When Finn had taken enough, not too much for a belly still learning, Maeve dabbed his mouth with the corner of a tea towel and set to the practical intimacies, a warm, damp cotton pad, and gentle strokes to stimulate a wee, so his pouch would remain a nest rather than a mess, so his skin would not crack. She smoothed a whisper of lanolin along the thread-like tail and over the small fingers, where skin sat like a fragile sleeve. Outside, the sun had hoisted itself onto the paddock fence and poured its intent into the day. The frost had retreated in embarrassed patches from the trampoline of the water tank. A flock of galas argued merrily in the pepper tree, pink and gray punctuation in the crisp air. Inside, Karinya narrowed to a hearth, a pouch, a breath. Maeve set the alarm on her old Nokia. 3 hours, then 3 hours, then 3 hours again, the slow metronome of survival. She pegged Finn's pouch at the perfect angle by the heater, checked the thermometer, 33.5, that sweet, remembered country, and listened for the small, steady purr of his breathing. Rusty settled at the base of the chair, chin on paws, eyes half closed and wholly watchful, a sentinel who had no shift to knock off from. Maeve rinsed the little bottle, lined it beside 3 more in a row, and allowed herself a single stolen minute to sit on the hearth's stone lip, palms facing the warmth, eyes on the curve of the pouch, where Finn made the tiniest of kicks like commas in a sentence not yet written. The land outside would demand its taxes. The day would pile its chores. The water trough with the leak, the feed bin lid the crows had learned to pry, the invoices, the grant application she hated writing. But here, now, a life had turned toward the light. "All right," she said softly, "to the room, to the day, to the missing, to the arriving. We begin." And in the hush that followed, Karinya kept its promise, a place to rest and to rise again. Maeve checked the pouch one last time, adjusted the hot water bottle, and hung the second, spare pouch within arm's reach. The heater ticked gently. Finn slept. The battle, as always, began with warmth, milk, and an old dog's faithful breath. The nights that followed were the sort that made you hear every creak in the old house. Out beyond the pepper trees, the moon laid a silver track across the paddock, frost whispering its slow script over the grass. The inland wind prowled under the eaves and rattled the loose iron on the woodshed. Inside, the lounge had become a triage ward. 3 canvas pouches hung by the heater, each with its tiny occupant. But the smallest, Finn, commanded the most attention. The warm smell of milk powder and eucalyptus ointment mingled with the smoke of the slow-burning log. Maeve O'Connor had always been the kind of woman who could go without sleep if the job needed it. As a ranger, she had once spent 3 straight days tracking a pair of injured brumbies through flood country. That discipline returned now in the slow routine of alarms, feedings, and checkups. Her face, lined and freckled, seemed to have grown more angular in the thin light of the kerosene lamp. On the first night, Finn refused the bottle, turning his head weakly, his mouth clamped shut. Maeve adjusted the teat, her fingers steady though her jaw tightened. The joey's tongue caught awkwardly against the rubber, a common problem with animals so young. She cupped his jaw between thumb and forefinger, coaxing, murmuring low. Rusty the Kelpie planted himself by her knee, the torch beam of his gaze fixed on the joey as if willing it to learn. The old dog's graying brows gave him the look of a skeptical old uncle. But every time Finn so much as shifted his tiny tail, Rusty's ears tipped forward, hopeful. Just after midnight, the front door rattled softly, and a familiar figure slipped inside. It was Lorna Kemp, Maeve's nearest neighbor, a widow of about 60, tall and raw-boned from decades of fencing her own small holding. Her gray hair, cut short for practicality, was streaked with the pale yellow of country dust, and her skin had the smooth burnish of someone who had worked under the sky all her life. Lorna had a blunt, good-natured way of speaking, and a habit of carrying thermoses of strong tea wherever she went. "I saw your ute light up when you came back," Lorna said in a half-whisper. "Figured you'd have your hands full." She set down the thermos and a plate of date slice on the old pine table. "Thought you could do with this. Haven't seen you keep a joey that small in years." Maeve's mouth softened. "This one's a stubborn little thing. Mouth won't cooperate." Lorna leaned forward, peering into the pouch by the heater. "Scrawny as a twig. But you know, the scrawny ones sometimes surprise you. Battlers, like most of us out here." The 2 women worked in companionable silence for a time, Maeve holding the bottle, Lorna checking the temperature of the hot water packs and rubbing warmth back into Finn's feet with a soft cloth. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant bleat of a lamb and the rustle of dry saltbush. At 3 in the morning, Maeve finally managed to get Finn to latch properly, his fragile tongue curling just so. The joey drank slowly, his sides trembling with the effort, but when he swallowed, the sound was clear and sure. Rusty wagged his tail once, as if announcing a small victory. Maeve weighed Finn on the digital scale, a mere 270 grams, only a slight gain since the rescue. She noted the number in a well-worn logbook, whose pages bore the names of many Joeys past. By dawn, she had completed 3 feedings. The east turned pale behind the pepper trees, and magpies began their liquid carols. Lorna dozed in a wooden chair with a blanket around her shoulders, her strong, weathered hands still resting lightly on the edge of Finn's pouch. Just after sunrise, a white-painted ute came up the track in a puff of dust. From it climbed Dr. Callum Reed, the district vet, a man in his late 40s with a rangy frame and the stooped shoulders of someone used to long days bent over animals. His sandy blonde hair was cropped short, peppered with early gray, and he wore a week-old stubble that made his square face seem more severe than it really was. A thin scar curved above his right eyebrow, a relic of being kicked by a young colt in his apprentice years. It lent him a slightly wary look. Callum was a quiet, thoughtful sort, known for his patience with creatures and his dry humor with humans. He had driven out before starting his surgery shift in town, a battered stethoscope looped like a scarf around his neck. "Morning, Maeve. Heard you had a late-night arrival," he said, stepping into the warm lounge and letting his boots thump gently on the old floorboards. Maeve shifted so he could peer into the pouch. Gray male, about 3 months. Still weak, but he finally took some milk. Callum crouched beside the pouch, the movement easy for a man used to kneeling on stable floors. He examined Finn with a practiced gentleness, checking the tiny gums, the soft belly, the still-sealed eyes. "No sign of trauma, that's good. Keep the feeds small and frequent. Main thing now is warmth and patience." Lorna stirred from her doze and offered him a cup from the thermos. "She's going to wear herself out again," she remarked, nodding towards Maeve. "Nothing new," Callum replied with a ghost of a smile. That second night was harder. A cool change swept through after dusk, rattling the screen door and making the heater groan to keep up. Finn whimpered in his sleep, a faint, breathy sound like dry grass rubbing together. Maeve rose every 3 hours without complaint, her eyes shadowed but steady. Rusty followed her, tail low but wagging, ever watchful. She sang softly while feeding Finn, an old bush lullaby her late husband Liam had favored when settling colts, more rhythm than tune, but it soothed her as much as the Joey. On the third night, Finn began to wriggle more in his pouch between feeds, a tiny, restless energy that made Maeve exchange a glance with Lorna. "Good sign," Lorna murmured. "Little bloke's finding his fight." By the week's end, the routine had settled into its own rough music, 3-hour alarms, bottle warmers humming, the scratch of pen in logbook, Rusty's soft snore, the faint rustle of the pouch as Finn shifted in sleep. The longest night came with a thunderstorm rolling in from the west. The first crack of lightning shook the old windows, and Rusty padded anxiously between Maeve and the hearth. The lights flickered, and for a tense hour, Maeve fed Finn by torchlight, while Lorna kept the kettle warm on the wood stove. The Joey sucked more eagerly than ever before, oblivious to the racket outside. When dawn returned, soft and pale over the wet paddocks, Maeve found herself smiling faintly, despite the ache in her shoulders. She checked Finn's weight. He had gained another 10 grams. Small, but in the rescue world, each gram was a tiny, stubborn victory. For the first time since bringing him home, Maeve allowed herself a brief doze in the old armchair. Rusty curled at her feet. Outside, the magpies sang as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. Late autumn crept in with mornings that smelled of damp hay and wood smoke. The paddocks around Karinya wore a veil of low fog so thin it looked as if the earth was still dreaming. In the sunroom, Maeve had set up a little play corner for the Joeys, who were older than Finn, thicker in the haunches, their coats already a soft ash gray. Here they learned to hop short, wobbly hops on choir matting, and snuffle curiously at tufts of fresh-cut grass Maeve brought in each day. Finn, though still small, had begun to poke his narrow nose out of his pouch, blinking at the world with eyes as dark and bright as wet seeds. Rusty often sat nearby like a grizzled schoolteacher, his tail thumping whenever Finn tried to wriggle forward. One breezy afternoon, Maeve returned from the vet's with two new charges. The first was Lark, a 7-month-old male joey, lanky and leggy, with a white streak along his muzzle like an unfinished brushstroke. He had been found orphaned on a sheep station west of Coonabarra Bran, shy of people but quick to follow other joeys. When frightened, he hid his face under his forelegs, a habit that made the volunteers smile. The second was Sasha, a 1-year-old female Eastern Grey, with a fine, dove-colored coat and deep brown eyes that watched everything warily. A bushfire the previous summer had separated her from her mother. Though healthy, she had a skittish streak and often positioned herself between smaller joeys and strangers, as if instinctively protecting them. Maeve placed their pouches beside Finn's by the heater for the first night, letting them settle into the scent and warmth of the household. Finn sniffed at Lark's ear and then nestled back into his own pouch. Sasha lifted her head and gazed at the newcomer with a slow blink, as if recognizing another who had known loss. A new voice joined the household the next morning when Jed Parker, a 19-year-old volunteer from the local TAFE, arrived in a dented motorbike helmet and jeans splattered with red soil. Jed was rangy and slightly stooped from working long hours on his uncle's sheep run, with a mop of sandy brown hair that fell into eyes the color of bottle glass. He had a bashful grin that made him look younger than his years, and an easy kindness with animals that came from having raised potty lambs since he was a child. "Reckon I'm here to do the heavy lifting," Jed joked, as Maeve handed him a bucket of kangaroo milk replacer. "And maybe learn a thing or two." Finn's health was improving enough that he could spend a few hours each day in the sunroom. Maeve let him clamber cautiously out of the pouch onto the choir mat, where he sniffed the new grass and wobbled to his feet. Lark hopped sideways in an awkward burst, startled by his own legs, then looked back as if to say he hadn't meant it. Sasha watched from the edge, ears twitching, until Finn tipped forward onto his nose and made a squeaky complaint. She bounded over, bumping him gently upright with her chest, earning a small laugh from Maeve. "Looks like she's adopted him already," Lorna remarked, leaning in the doorway with a thermos. As the days passed, the three joeys began to share a routine, morning feeds followed by short sunroom playtimes. Jed built a small outdoor pen from old stockyard rails, lining it with soft soil and scattered tufts of native grass. Here, the joeys learned to hop short circuits while the autumn sun soaked their thin coats. Finn was still the smallest, and often grew tired first, retreating to his pouch in Maeve's lap. But his curiosity about the world showed in the way he flicked his ears toward every new sound. The creak of a windmill, the rumble of a distant tractor, the magpie's 2-note call. One afternoon, a commotion broke out when Toby, the long-resident cockatoo with a mended wing, waddled across the veranda railing to scold the joeys. Toby was a snowy white bird, with a ragged crest and a rasping laugh that carried clear across the yard. He had been with Maeve for nearly a decade and fancied himself the supervisor of all newcomers. The joeys stared at him wide-eyed as he fluffed his crest and barked a few bossy words. Lark bolted behind a feed bucket. Finn froze mid-hop, and Sasha flicked her ears in annoyance, but stood her ground. Toby finally clicked his beak and shuffled off, satisfied he had reminded everyone whose yard it was. Evenings brought the household together in the lounge. The joeys in their pouches, Rusty stretched across the rug, Toby perched like a faded ornament on the chairback, Maeve writing notes in her logbook, while Lorna knitted by the fire. Outside, the bush settled into the long hush of night. In that rhythm of shared care, Finn grew a little stronger each week. He still needed his 3-hour feeds, but his gaze had become steadier, and he now stretched his ears forward when hearing Maeve's voice. The house that had once seemed too large for one woman now felt alive with small, breathing hearts. Winter arrived with a brittle wind that made the windmill creak like an old gate and scattered pale gum leaves across the paddock. The ground turned hard, and the morning frost lingered well past sunrise. Karinya's lounge remained a warm refuge, but the Joeys now spent a few hours each day in the outdoor pen, hopping among the tufts of native grass Maeve and Jed planted. It was after one such afternoon that Maeve noticed Finn sitting listlessly in his pouch, refusing his feed and twitching his ears with discomfort. A faint looseness in his droppings made her frown. She remembered too well what such signs could mean. She phoned Dr. Callum Reed, who arrived the next morning in his dust-colored ute, stethoscope swinging from the rearview mirror. His eyes scanned the Joey with the quiet focus of a man accustomed to fragile patience. "Could be early coccidia," he said gravely, after checking Finn's gums and belly. "Common when they start grazing. We'll run a test on his droppings to be sure." The words made Maeve's chest tighten. Coccidia had claimed more than one Joey at Karinya in years past. The parasite thrived in damp soil, entering the gut of young kangaroos and often proving fatal. To reduce risk, Callum advised restricting Finn's grazing and keeping him in a dry, warm enclosure. Maeve moved his pouch back to the hearth, except for brief, supervised sun sessions. Meanwhile, the district was hit by a cold snap, followed by 3 days of icy rain that turned the pens muddy and chilled the air. Maeve and Jed worked side by side, shoveling fresh sand into the play yard and rigging a tarpaulin roof to keep the ground drier. Lorna came daily with fresh thermoses of tea and honey cakes, bringing both comfort and watchful eyes. Finn's appetite dipped during the wet week. Maeve fed him with even greater care, using smaller but more frequent feeds, stroking his tiny chest to keep his swallowing steady. Rusty hardly left his side, often lying near the heater, his muzzle just inches from the pouch, as if guarding it against unseen harm. In the midst of this worry, Maeve remembered a local bush trick she had once heard of, using goat's milk to build resistance in Joeys. On Karinya's lower paddock grazed a small herd of milking goats tended by Lorna's nephew. She asked him for a small daily measure to mix into Finn's feeds, hoping its natural antibodies might give the youngster a fighting chance. Callum remained cautious, but agreed it was worth trying. "Sometimes it's the odd bush remedy that surprises you," he said with a brief smile, though his eyes stayed thoughtful. Each evening, the wind rattled the iron roof, and rain hissed against the windows, while Maeve sat by the hearth, coaxing Finn to take one more sip, one more swallow. The Joey's ears drooped, and his once bright gaze dulled, but he did not give up. Sasha often settled nearby as if lending silent company, and Lark's awkward hops slowed as he lingered at the pouch's edge. By the second week, the rain eased. A pale sun returned, glinting on damp fences, and making the paddock steam like shallow ponds. Maeve weighed Finn again, and found that he had not lost weight further. A small plateau, but enough to lift her spirits. "Hold on, little bloke," she murmured, brushing a fingertip along his narrow brow. "We'll see you through this." The Joey twitched his ears, a faint sign of recognition, and nestled deeper into the warm cloth. For Maeve, it was hope enough to keep fighting. The winter nights in the western plains had a way of stretching long and thin, like the blue shadows that lingered after sundown. At Karinya, the iron roof clicked as it cooled, the gum trees creaked in the frost, and a sharp breeze prowled through the fence lines, as if testing for weak places. Inside, the lounge smelled of warmed milk, eucalyptus balm, and the slow ember of the wood stove. Finn had come far since his early fragile days, yet Maeve knew the battle wasn't over. His ribs still showed faintly when he stretched, and his hind legs trembled if he hopped too long. The coccidia scare had passed, but it left her cautious. She and Jed arranged a new routine: gentle exercise in the outdoor pen after mid-morning sun warmed the soil, then back inside to rest by the heater. The pen itself had grown into a miniature playground. Under Jed's patient work, discarded fence rails became little hurdles, and soft piles of sand made safe mounds for hopping practice. Maeve brought in sprigs of native grasses, teaching the young roos to graze while keeping them under watch for any stomach trouble. Lark, the lanky one, quickly turned the pen into his personal racetrack. Sasha, steady and protective, often stepped between Lark's bursts of enthusiasm and the still frail Finn. Rusty, though stiff in the joints, made it his mission to supervise every session. He sat on his haunches at the pen's corner, ears pricked, amber eyes following the joeys as if counting each hop. One afternoon, Finn surprised them all. While Maeve was checking the water bowl and Jed was refitting a loose hinge on the pen gate, Finn clambered out of his pouch and wobbled toward a low mound of sand. He crouched, rocked uncertainly, then sprang forward. Only a short hop, but solid, landing upright with ears forward. Jed let out a low whistle. "Look at the little bloke go," he said, grinning under his dusty fringe. Maeve's lips curved into a rare, quiet smile. "He's finding his legs." Such small triumphs kept them going through the cold days. They had no way of knowing that a sterner test waited just ahead. Late in August, the Westerlies arrived, roaring across the open country, flattening the speargrass and dragging dust devils over the paddocks. By the third day, the sky was bruised with storm clouds, and the air smelled of distant rain. Maeve double-checked the heater, secured the pouches by the hearth, and asked Jed to reinforce the pen rails. That night, the storm struck like a hammer. Thunder rolled over the plains with a long iron groan, lightning flickered across the hills, and sheets of rain rattled the tin roof. Rusty padded back and forth, uneasy, then stationed himself beside Finn's pouch. Maeve had just finished a feed when a sharp crack came from outside, the sound of the yard gate banging open under the gale. Jed grabbed a torch and dashed out into the slanting rain. The pen's wooden rail had come loose and swung wildly, one end clattering against the shelter wall. Inside the pen, Sasha and Lark huddled under the tarp, eyes wide and ears flattened at each flash of light. Maeve, alarmed, moved to the doorway with Finn cradled against her chest, intending to help Jed. A sudden gust rattled the screen door. Finn, startled by the noise, wriggled free and staggered toward the pen. Maeve reached after him, but in that instant, the swinging rail lurched inward. Sasha, trying to retreat, slipped on the muddy ground. To Jed's astonishment, Finn, still unsteady, barely more than a juvenile, pushed forward and butted gently against Sasha's flank, nudging her sideways out of the rail's path. Jed lunged in time to grab the loose rail and haul it back, then lashed it with a length of rope. Maeve scooped up the joey, her heart pounding. Finn's ears trembled, his thin chest rising and falling fast, but he was unhurt. He blinked up at her with a strange, calm focus, as if unaware of his own small heroism. "Brave little fella," Jed murmured, rain dripping off his chin as he checked the gate again. They brought the soaked joeys inside, drying their fur gently with soft towels, the heater humming like a tired friend. Sasha kept close to Finn all night, often nosing him as if in quiet thanks. The storm spent itself by dawn, leaving the air rinsed clean and the paddocks shining with pools of rainwater. The morning sun slanted low through the wet gum leaves, lighting the tiny droplets on the joey's fur like a scatter of stars. Maeve weighed Finn that afternoon. The number on the scale showed a slow but steady gain. She stroked the ridge of his narrow brow and smiled softly. "That's the spirit, lad," she said. "A heart as strong as the country itself." For Maeve, that night's small drama marked a turning point. Finn was no longer merely a creature to be saved, but a young kangaroo with the instinct to protect. By early spring, the paddocks around Karinya turned green again, dotted with wattles glowing like little suns, and alive with the whistle of fairy wrens. The air held a faint sweetness from the new grass, and the soil released the stored scent of rain whenever the morning mist lifted. Finn had outgrown the pouch. His shoulders showed a faint golden hue, and his hops were now clean and quick, muscles firm under the once thin skin. Lark, still lanky and impulsive, often challenged him to races along the pen fence, while Sasha watched their games with the air of an older sister keeping order. Maeve knew the time was coming for the trio to return to the wild. It was a decision she always met with mixed feelings. Joy at seeing them ready for freedom, sorrow at letting them go. She called her old friend Ranger Elise Morley, who worked at the Warrumbungle Wildlife Reserve. Elise, in her late 30s, was tall and strong-armed from years in the field, her sun-freckled face framed by an auburn ponytail tucked through the back of a battered Akubra hat. Her frank, good-humored voice carried both authority and warmth. "Bring them up next week," Elise said over the phone. "We've a good patch near the creek where they can soft release. Safe grazing, shelter, other grays around. Best spot for their next step." On the appointed morning, Maeve loaded the travel crates onto the blue Hilux. Jed tightened the straps, while Lorna packed a cloth bag of cut hay, a flask of tea, and a few of her date slices. Rusty jumped into the passenger seat with the solemn dignity of a veteran road companion. The drive northward took them past wide paddocks, where young lambs bucked in the soft sunlight, and over shallow creeks still lined with silver puddles from recent rains. The sky widened into a hard, clean blue that deepened as they neared the dark crags of the Warrumbungle Ranges. At the reserve gate, Elise was waiting, her Akubra shading eyes as keen as a wedge-tail eagle's. She greeted Maeve with a clasp of calloused hands and leaned to look into the crate, where Finn twitched his ears but did not shrink back. "Good lad," she murmured. "Looks ready to meet his mob." They drove to a quiet basin near a ribbon of clear creek. Stands of ironbark and native cypress cast dappled shade, and in the distance, a few wild grays moved like quiet shadows among the grass. The air smelled of damp earth and wattle blossom. Maeve knelt by the first crate and unlatched the door. Lark burst out in a zigzag hop, paused, then began to graze with his head low. Sasha stepped out next, ears rotating like twin satellites as she surveyed the grassland, then moved with slow, measured hops toward the creek edge. Finn remained a moment longer, his dark eyes fixed on Maeve. For the first time, she noticed how tall he now stood when upright, the lines of his limbs strong yet graceful. He sniffed the breeze, then looked back at her, ears flicking forward. "It's your country now, little light," Maeve whispered. Finn bounded out at last, one clean, strong hop, then another, joining Sasha and Lark as they moved into the sunlit clearing. He paused once to look back, ears pricked and alert, before following the others toward the fringe of the ironbarks. Rusty gave a single wag of his tail, as if in salute. Elise stood beside Maeve, arms folded lightly. "You've done well. They'll find their way now, and they'll remember where they came from, in their own way." Jed, watching the young ruse vanish into the tall grass, shifted his dusty cap. "Strange, isn't it? Feels like saying goodbye to old mates." Maeve nodded, a small ache behind her smile. "That's the way it's meant to be. We're just the bridge." They stayed a while longer, ensuring the trio had begun to graze and mingle near the wild mob by the creek. The late afternoon sun cast long, slanting bars of gold across the reserve, warming the ironbark trunks and setting the wattle blooms aflame. Birds called from the shadows, as if bidding the young ruse welcome. When at last they turned the Hilux back toward Karinya, Maeve felt the usual mixture of loss and quiet pride. Another chapter closed, another small family given back to the land. Beside her, Rusty rested his muzzle on his paws, content with the day's work. Back at the homestead, as dusk gathered over the paddocks, Maeve lit the lamp in the lounge. The empty pouches hung by the hearth stirred slightly in the draft, like sails waiting for the next voyage. She placed the logbook on the table and, with steady hand, entered the day's note. Finn, Sasha, Lark, released to Warrumbungle Reserve, strong and healthy. She looked out at the darkening land, listening to the distant wind over the plains. Somewhere out there, Finn was learning the old songs of grass and river and wide sky. The thought eased the hollow place in her chest. Out here in the quiet bush, sometimes the smallest heartbeat is the greatest miracle. Watching little Finn, once so fragile, now leaping free under the wide Australian sky, reminds us that hope is never truly lost. Many of us who have lived long enough know this truth. Life often asks for patience, a gentle hand, and a heart willing to care. Whether it's rescuing a Joey on the roadside, lending a neighbor a hand after a storm, or simply offering a warm cup of tea to a lonely soul, these small acts carry a light that can change the world around us. To those who hold faith close, such moments feel like the Lord's tender work, quiet, steady, and full of grace. Each rescued animal, each life given another chance, is a soft whisper of God's love shining through the kindness of ordinary people. If Finn's story has touched your heart, please share it so that others may feel the same hope. Leave a comment to tell us about the little acts of kindness you've witnessed or offered in your own life, for a neighbor, for a creature in need, or for a stranger. And if you'd like to keep hearing these gentle stories of hope, please subscribe to our channel. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones, keep you safe in His care, and guide us all to cherish the land, the creatures, and each other.